Right. I started to work at the Trolley Museum because I found the Trolley Museum. I love railroady things. I do woodwork. I went down there one day, rode on a trolley, asked somebody if I could volunteer to do anything, and they said, well, what can you do? And I said, I'm a cabinet maker. They grabbed me by the sleeve and towed me right up to Sally's office and pushed me in the door and said, here's a cabinet maker. She grabbed me by the sleeve and dragged me up to the shop and pushed me in there at Randy and said, here's a cabinet maker. So suddenly I'm doing some woodwork. I work in my own shop because then I can do some of this, turn around and do some of my own work because I make furniture and I'm still working, so I have to have some time here. So I do most of what I do here and then take it down rather than working in the museum shop. Also, I can spread things out to suit myself and I know where my own tools are and that sort of thing. But when I first got one of these things home, I had no understanding of how big a project this was going to be. It turns out to be a very complicated piece of wood. What I tried to do was very first take our only complete one and make the pattern. And I talked about making the pattern, but the day I was able to make this, then I had an outline of what I was going to make. Then I thought I would try to make one to see what I needed in order to make it. This is the one I made at that time out of lumberyard, 2x6s. Actually, it would be a 2x8 because this is all one piece, like the car ones, because we thought we were going to make these all one piece at one point, but then we discovered this issue with the cross grain and the braking, and it just seemed silly to do that. Anyway, the first thing I had to do was make a piece of wood 1 5/8 thick because wood doesn't come 1 5/8 thick. So I glued a couple of my 2x8s together and made a big piece of wood, seen there. And then I traced out on my big piece of lumberyard wood using my pattern, traced out the outline, sawed it out on the bandsaw, just what I showed you. Then I started to make the jigs that we'll use to actually do the shaping of these things. The first idea I had was that these were going to be cut out of single boards before we got talking about finger joints. So I made the first jig, which is here, as if it were going to accept one big board. I was going to have the board edge against here, and it was going to do the first cut, which is the back of this thing, the first outline cut, which is this. And I thought once I have that cut out, then I can use that back as a reference point to cut the front, and so on. I mean, I just have to establish some place as a starting point. Because I put 2 clamps down here because I knew I was going to be doing those little loose ends. And when we gave up the idea of doing one board, I moved this clamp in so that I could reach better. But this does the first cut, and it was the first thing I had to make. Once I made this, then I had to make 2 others of these to do the right and the left-hand side of this. And these cut, well, pattern in there, but you can see what they cut. They cut the curved inside. The only way I know to do this is with a shaper with a bearing running against the jig. It perhaps could be done on a router table, but I think the router table might be challenged. A router might be challenged for power on this amount of cutting, and it's just easier to do with a shaper since I've got one. I'm using it. So I made once I first got the outline and first got my piece cut out, I made this jig first. Then I made 2 of these, one for right and one for left. And then I had a blank cutout of this thing. Then I began to look at its various notches and grooves and tried to figure out how to do this. And in each case, these pieces would get clamped down to one of these jigs. I'd reset the shaper to cut one or the other of these patterns. Because I can't remember much of anything anymore, I've marked the order of cuts here. The very first thing I do to the blank, have to do to the blank, is round this over. The second thing I have to do, and if these things aren't done in order, it doesn't fit back in the jig right, or odd things happen. The second thing is to plow this groove, and because I can't remember anything, I've written in the groove just what the shaper setup is, so that I know when I go to get shaper cutters, I need this cutter, this collar, this part, because it has to cut deep. This is the third cut, the place where the window goes, and same thing, it's upside down, but I mean, I've told myself what cutters I need for it, so I don't have to go look every time. And then this is the last cut, this thing along here, and this thing along here was a very challenging cut to make. It's not a usual type of woodworking cut, and it involves running the shaper bit that does this cut upside down and with the smallest rub collar that's made, and luckily with the smallest rub collar and the cutter running upside down, it'll make this piece that's shaped here and then has this little round over up here. But this is a complicated one, as anybody who does woodwork would recognize. There's no way to do that on a router table or anything like that. And I don't know how they did it back at Laconia.
Yeah, I was wondering, this was 1912 technology.
I think they must have done something very like what I did.
Yeah.
There's no way they did this. People say, oh, they did things with hand planes. No, you couldn't hand plane around a curve like that.
Yeah.
You just couldn't.
Interesting.
They must. I mean, they had routers, steam-driven routers and things then, and big routers that were effectively shapers. They must have done something more or less exactly like I'm doing. I mean, I think I've reverse engineered the process. Maybe they know something I didn't, but
not going to be able to ask anybody today.
But I called the Laconia helpline and nobody picked up.